to Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult to see how Ukraine would agree to that. Much more coming in, and we will talk about that in just a moment. But in fact, there is more coming in, and the White House is saying the two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. So that's from the White House saying that. And Putin agrees with Trump, another line coming out, to stop hitting Ukrainian energy targets. We've heard about that for 30 days. So that ceasefire and energy targets limited to 30 days. Let's go over to the White House and Mark Stone. And Mark, so it's beginning to come through. And look, I'm reading it as you're probably reading it, but it looks like the important point is a limited ceasefire, limited to energy and infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that means. I think we'll hopefully get some clarity on that at the moment. Does it mean that fighting along the front line will still continue, but that both sides will agree not to target the other's energy and infrastructure facilities, perhaps? There's also discussions about the implementation of a maritime ceasefire. So, I mean, this is new. This appears to be ceasefire bit by bit, so not a complete ceasefire, as was expected, but bit by bit on key areas of the war will be halted. But that will still mean that the fighting along that front line would go on. So let's wait and see whether any officials either here or at the Kremlin can give us more detail on precisely what that means. And of course, in Kyiv, what they make of this, because the way these negotiations are going, we haven't yet got all sides around the table. The conversation today was just President Putin and Trump. President Zelensky is on a trip to a visit to Finland at the moment. The other point that you were referencing there, this apparent demand by the Russian side that the Americans have to halt all military aid for the period of the ceasefire. That means that no American weapons can be shipped, and presumably that means European weapons as well, can be shipped to Ukraine during this ceasefire period. Now, that will be an issue for Ukraine. Of course, I imagine behind the scenes, Western military figures will be trying to determine whether that would impede Ukraine at all, whether actually they've got enough that the weaponry's been front-loaded to enough of an extent to allow the pause to happen, to meet this demand from the other side for that period of 30 days. So again, that's something that we will look for clarity on. But for me, I mean, it's just, I might have read this or interpreted this wrong, but it seems to suggest a staged ceasefire with energy and infrastructure beginning first, then a maritime ceasefire. That's of course in the Black Sea, where there has been much fighting as well, and then a more broad ceasefire after that. That's my interpretation at this stage, certainly.
Mark, I mean, but no guarantees of those. I mean, they're talking about a 30-day ceasefire regarding energy infrastructure at the moment, just to be, as far as I read it.
Yeah, well, precisely, and certainly not what perhaps Donald Trump had hoped he would be able to do, in fact, on day one of his presidency. But certainly, I think he thought that maybe it would be easier than it is turning out to be. I mean, he would like to be able to stand in front of a podium as soon as he possibly can here at the White House and announce that he has achieved a full ceasefire. From this readout, from the words that we're getting here, that doesn't appear to be the result of this call.
OK, Mark, thank you very much. And we await further word from the White House. But let's just, we're going to speak in a moment to the former ambassador to Moscow, Tony Brenton. But let's just have a quick word with Ivor Bennett, who's in Moscow. And Ivor, it does seem then that these conditions that President Putin first started talking about last week have now been presented formally, as it were, over the phone to President Trump.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. I'm just going through the Kremlin's readout, which is pretty comprehensive, and there's a lot of crossover, obviously, with what has come from the White House. But as you say, that one of the key points that's jumped out to me is this statement that the root causes of the conflict need to be eliminated, and that, of course, is Vladimir Putin's code. It's Kremlin code for saying that Russia's security concerns need to be met and that Russia's red lines need to be met, i.e. This issue that Vladimir Putin keeps coming back to, no NATO membership for Ukraine, no NATO troops as peacekeepers there. That is one of the paragraphs in this readout. He says, the Kremlin says, having confirmed his fundamental commitment to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, the Russian president declared his readiness to thoroughly work out possible ways of settlement together with his American partners, and goes on to say, of course, take into account the absolute need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, Russia's legitimate interests in the field of security. So he will have discussed his red lines, and I think that's very obvious, a statement that they have not gone away. But having said that, they have agreed something. It's a long way short of a full ceasefire, a full 30-day ceasefire on the front line that Kyiv signed up to this time last week in Saudi Arabia with the Americans. But they have agreed this to mutually refrain, the Kremlin says, from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. And we're told that Vladimir Putin immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So there is something there. But as Mark says, we still await the exact details of what that really means on the ground. And also, we have a confirmation that tomorrow there is a prisoner exchange between Russian and Ukrainian forces, 175 people for 175. Also, the Kremlin says, as a gesture of goodwill, 23 seriously wounded Ukrainian servicemen who are undergoing treatment in Russia will be transferred. So there has been some agreement here, and there will be a ceasefire of sorts, but it's baby steps. It's nowhere near what Donald Trump wanted to announce, and nothing like what Kyiv signed up to a week ago.
No, because the bottom line, Ivor, is that the war goes on, and at the moment the war appears to be going in Vladimir Putin's favour. So I suppose why would he want to sign this ceasefire without all the conditions he's now putting up?
Well, exactly. There's nothing in his interest, right? What does he stand to gain? At the moment, he has the overwhelming advantage on the battlefield, and particularly, and what is really important for Vladimir Putin, I think, is what's happening in Russia's Kursk region, where Russia, after 7 months after Ukraine launched their incursion there and gained a foothold that they hope to use as a bargaining chip come negotiations, it seems like Russia's forces are on the verge of kicking them out. And this was Vladimir Putin visiting Kursk region for the first time since that incursion, this time last week, almost on Wednesday evening, I believe it was. Clearly felt confident enough to go to the region, dressed in military fatigues, which is very rare indeed, to go and tell his forces to continue their work there and try and eject and expel the Ukrainian forces as fast as possible. So there's no talk of ceasefire there. He wants Russia to get rid of the Ukrainians as soon as possible. He doesn't want to lose that advantage. And there is a paragraph in the Kremlin's communique on Kursk, actually, framing it that the Kremlin is doing Donald Trump and Ukraine a favor. He says, Vladimir Putin, in connection with Donald Trump's recent appeal to save the lives of Ukrainian servicemen surrounded in the Kursk region, which itself is a claim that's disputed by Ukraine. They say they're not surrounded. Vladimir Putin confirmed that the Russian side is ready to be guided by humanitarian considerations and, in the event of surrender, guarantees the lives of Ukrainian armed forces, soldiers, and decent treatment in accordance with Russian laws and international law. So he's not saying he's going to pause fighting there. He's saying that if they agree to surrender, then we'll allow them, we'll guarantee their lives. Still very much pursuing a victory in Kursk that he can sell to the Russian people and try and eliminate, I think, that aspect and that factor of future negotiations. As I say, Ukraine wanted to have that as a bargaining chip, but he intends that to not be the case. And Yeah, so long as they have the military advantage they have, time is on their side, obviously.
OK, Ivor, thank you very much. I do now want to bring in the former British ambassador to Moscow, Sir Tony Brenton. Thank you very much for being patient for us there. And well, first of all, what do you make of what's coming out of the Kremlin?
Well, it seems to have come out rather well from the Russian point of view. Putin went into this meeting with two key objectives, really. Firstly, to establish a good relationship with Trump, because emerging from the Ukraine war with a good US-Russian relationship will be very valuable to the Russia when they start talking about other things like nuclear weapons and so on. But secondly, retaining enough freedom of maneuver to ensure that Russia can do what it feels it needs to do on the battlefield, which specifically, and you've already heard a lot about this, to finish off the Kursk war, to get the Ukrainians out of Kursk, which then clears the way for a ceasefire on the ground as well. And he seems to have succeeded in both of those objectives. On the other hand, I mean, Trump has got the energy infrastructure ceasefire, so he's got something to announce. They've set up a couple of expert groups and so on. It all sounds to me as if things are moving gradually from Russia's point of view, but also to some extent from Trump's point of view, in the right direction.
Yes, and but it does look as well, though, that President Putin has just outlined the same conditions he was talking about last week. And when he says there's this absolute need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, that is a very wide-ranging condition.
Yeah, you're right. There's still some very tough negotiations to come. It will be interesting to see if, as a condition for the bigger ceasefire, following what we've got at the moment, the Americans are actually willing to cut off arms supplies and intelligence delivery, which is part of what has damaged Ukraine's position in Kursk last time round. I find it hard to judge how firmly the Russians are when they talk about the root causes of all of this. I think that basically, and again, one of your correspondents suggested this, their key aim here is the reason they got into this war is because they felt their security threatened by the expansion of NATO, and in particular by the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. And I think they want that danger eliminated as part of any eventual peace agreement, which means they want a commitment, not necessarily going into the ceasefire, but certainly as part of the discussions which it leads to, being a commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO, and other dispositions where forces go on and so on and so forth, which give the Russians the security assurances which they feel they need.
Yeah, I mean, there's two different things here. There's the ceasefire, the 30-day ceasefire, interim ceasefire, and then a sort of peace agreement down the road. But the Russians seem to be saying, unless I've misread this, that they want this halt on foreign military aid and intelligence to Ukraine before they'll agree to a part of the 30-day ceasefire, unless I'm misreading that. But that, I mean, would Ukraine ever agree to that, I suppose, is the question.
Well, it's not a matter for Ukraine, if Ukraine will agree to it. It's a matter of whether the United States will agree to it. And, it depends how tough Trump is feeling. But Trump badly wants to get a complete ceasefire. And I suspect you'll be able to work out some sort of deal. And this is only, after all, for 30 days. And I understand that military people all around are now asking themselves, do we believe that Ukraine has enough already supplied on the ground for this not to affect their military effectiveness too much? And the answer to that will then be part of America's answer to this demand from Russia. This is, as you say, separate from Russia's demands for the eventual peace agreement that Ukraine will never join NATO and all of that stuff.
And just finally, Sir Tony, I mean, do you think Putin is genuinely interested in some sort of peace?
Yes, I do. I think Western commentators have exaggerated, and he thinks he's winning the war, which is true. But he certainly doesn't want to ultimately alienate Trump. He wants to come out of this, yes, with the war over, yes, able to present to his people a moderate success, which he will certainly be able to do if he can come away with some territorial gains and an assurance that Ukraine will never join NATO. But he certainly doesn't want to insist on all that at the price of having a constructive relationship with the US going forward. And it sounds as if the outcome of this first meeting have taken him a significant step in that direction.
Sir Tony, thank you very much indeed for being with us this evening. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Michael Clark, our defence analyst, is with me. So it I mean, is it coincidence that most of this information seems to be coming out of the Kremlin at the moment?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, the Kremlin wants to put this out
Yes.
Before the White House has got its version of the story out. And what it looks like at the moment is a sort of a rough version of what Zelensky was proposing. He said, look, we can have an air and sea ceasefire as a first step. And the Americans had then said, well, we need a ground ceasefire as well. And Zelensky said, fine. The point is, an air and sea ceasefire, and a sea ceasefire is fairly easy to arrange in the Black Sea. An air ceasefire means not to target each other's critical national infrastructure. That's reasonably easy to organise, just stop firing at each other. But of course, a ground ceasefire is not what the Russians want, because they've just snuffed out the Kursk pocket. They've got 60 to 70,000 troops in Kursk, it seems, and even taken the North Koreans out of that calculation. They've got some good units there, the airborne and the Marines, who they will then rework into the southern battle. Over, I would imagine, well within 30 days. So the fact that there's no ceasefire on the ground...
Are the Ukrainians out of Kursk now, effectively?
In effect, yes, they are. The Kursk pocket is finished.
So that bargaining chip...
Has gone. Has gone. Yeah, I mean, there may still be some who are trying to get out, but the majority of the 15,000 or so Ukrainians and most of the heavy equipment got out, and they rescued themselves from that situation. And it gave them some advantages, but it didn't give them the strategic advantage they really wanted. But the Russians can now redeploy a very heavy set of units into the battle elsewhere in the south.
Before any 30-day ceasefire takes effect.
Yeah, you take a unit out of Ukraine, out of Kursk, and you give it some rest and rehabilitation, and you re-equip a little bit, and you might be able to stagger it with other units who are then more available. But effectively, something like 50 to 60,000 troops should now be available to be fed into the battle further south.
Right.
Within the time we're talking about. Within 2 to 3 weeks.
With the point being to make more progress.
Yeah.
In the south and east.
Yeah, and as this ceasefire negotiation goes on, and it will, I think, go on for quite a long time, the calculation from the Russian military must be that they'll be able now to take some of the strategic ground in around Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Chasiv Yar, that they've got close to but still failed to take all this winter. And that as the weather improves,
they'll feel we need a map there, but I can't say
Exactly.
that those places you're mentioning are all around.
Strategically, yeah, all in the southeast.
Right.
They are strategically important, unlike Bakhmut that really wasn't. But they could take some strategically important areas and effectively grab the whole of the Donbass during the early to midsummer period.
Right.
If they don't have to go through a ceasefire on the ground, I'm sure the Russian military would be pretty happy about that.
Michael, stay with us, because we're just going to talk to Mark Stone in Washington once again, but I also want to talk about what's going on in the Middle East, because Benjamin Netanyahu is due to speak at 6 o'clock UK time. We're expecting to hear from him, so let's just prepare for that. But Mark Stone at the White House, so are you beginning to hear a bit more now from how the Trump administration are viewing this?
No, not in black and white, but we're getting a slightly clearer understanding of, I guess, where the dust has settled on this all-important call. And it seems to me that both sides will take wins away from this. President Trump, will be able to say correctly that he has moved the dial on this long conflict. He's moved the dial towards peace. No, he cannot stand at a podium and say that he has achieved a full ceasefire, but he has achieved with perhaps concessions behind the scenes that we don't yet know about. And remember, these calls, we don't have a detailed transcript of precisely what was said, but with some behind-the-scenes deals, he has agreed to a phased ceasefire, as you were discussing, air and sea. And for President Putin, well, he can continue his land war. Remember that this is all about territory. With the Kursk region in Ukraine now pretty much in Russia, I should say, now pretty much taken back by the Russians, that allows Russia to redeploy those forces to the other front line, to the Donbass, where, as things stand at least, this ceasefire does not cover that. And so what the Russians will now want to do is to push that front line as far west as they can before President Putin decides he is at a point where he can sign on a dotted line to create a ceasefire. It's all about territory. So for him, this is a win too. He can say, fine, I'll stop bombing the energy infrastructure as long as Ukraine does the same inside Russia. But I'm not going to stop fighting, because he wants to get as much territory in the east of the country as he possibly can. So on the face of it, both sides, the Americans and the Russians, will come out of today saying this is a good thing.
Yeah, and I see now the point you were making earlier about this staged ceasefire. The peace will begin with an energy infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of that maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. Full ceasefire, permanent peace. So that's from the White House. Mark, thanks very much indeed. So, Michael, I mean, I guess, well, Mark's right in the sense that Donald Trump is moving the dial.
He is, but remember that Putin's no KGB man, so he's been playing these games for the whole of his career, how to prevaricate and actually stretch things out and wheedle your opposition into concessions they perhaps didn't intend to make. I mean, the Americans will have to start being really quite tough, and they'll have to start digging their toes in if they want to prevent Putin just making this an endless discussion about modalities before you get to a ceasefire, because that's what he would like to do. Now, it may be that President Trump will get impatient with him and say, look, we're not going to do this. It's yes or no time. He might do that. But equally, Trump, who lives in the moment, he doesn't reflect very much on what's going on. He lives day to day in the moment. And it may well be that he just finds that he wants to go along with these things, because every little detail doesn't seem too bad until you put them all together. So I think we've got to, again, be aware of the way in which Putin will operate. And remember, there's
a few weeks away from an interim ceasefire.
I think we may well be. And there's an old diplomatic saying when it comes to big negotiations, say, if you're not at the table, you are probably on the menu. Yes. And believe me, Ukraine is on the menu.
Yeah. Well, in about 7 or 8 minutes, we're going to hear from Benjamin Netanyahu. So let's just switch to what's going on in Gaza. Why do you think that the Israelis have chosen this moment to break the ceasefire?
Because the ceasefire came to an end officially or phase one came to an end on the 1st of March. We got to the 18th of March, and it wasn't going anywhere else. And Netanyahu had always been facing a brick wall when phase one was completed, because his government would have collapsed if he had not gone to war again. And this was a fairly decisive moment. I mean, the right wingers in his government always said, if you don't resume the war, we're off.
Well, they came back today.
They came back today because the airstrikes clearly are a resumption of the war. And these weren't war.
So you see this as political as well as...
Very political, very political.
Because saving his neck.
Yeah.
Political neck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's partly his politics, partly because they felt that Hamas had been playing games with the phase two. But to be honest, I mean, both sides have been playing games with phase two. And Hamas was saying, let's move on to phase two as we agreed it. But of course, phase two was unacceptable to the Israelis because it meant discussing a permanent ceasefire, a permanent deal with Hamas as the other party. And, they've always said, we can't deal with Hamas. After the atrocity of the 7th of October 2023, we will not deal with Hamas. But equally, they've failed to completely destroy Hamas. They've dismantled it militarily, but it's still there as an organisation.
And, I mean, on that point, is it incompatible for the Israelis to destroy Hamas, which is their objective, and get all the hostages out? Is that a very difficult...
Probably, because the hostages, these 59 hostages that we believe are there, fewer than half of whom are probably still alive, they are Hamas's best card, and Hamas will not give them up willingly until either they're all dead, and then they won't admit that they're dead, I would imagine. They'll keep playing that card for as long as they possibly can, because it keeps pressure on the Netanyahu government. It gives them something always to bargain with, and makes it difficult for the Israelis to move in against Gaza quite in the way they would really like.
But the Israeli point, we've only got a minute and a half, but the Israeli point seems to be that by launching these heavy attacks on Gaza, that will persuade Hamas to hand over hostages. You don't think it
It might, but I mean, it didn't the first time round. I mean, the majority of hostages that were released, more than 100, were released in the first ceasefire during November 2023. After that, the hostage releases only came really as a result of this peace deal. It was arrived at in January by Joe Biden, let it be said, although with Trump's pressure behind it, let it also be said. But I mean, most of the hostages that have been released through negotiation, not through military pressure. And military pressure, we know, has had the effect of causing the deaths of some of them.
Yeah, and very briefly, the Israelis seem to be saying this could go on for a few days.
For sure, because they're issuing evacuation notices all the way down the strip between Israel and Gaza. And the point is, you don't issue evacuation notices unless you intend to keep on bombing. So this will, I'm sure, go on for a while yet.
Right, OK. Michael, thank you very much indeed. So there we are. The conversation between Presidents Putin and Trump has ended, and the main line out of it seems to be a limited ceasefire involving energy infrastructure. But we're going to talk about Israel at the top of the hour because Benjamin Netanyahu will be making a statement.